This time, it's our YAMAHA RXS100. Before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. Yamaha's RXS100 was one of the last two-strokes produced by Yamaha, or by any major Japanese manufacturer for that matter. Production ran between 1985 and 1996, when emission controls finally killed the two-stroke off. This particular bike dates to 1992, and we purchased it as a project bike for Tom. As it turned out, it was rather more of a project than we'd actually anticipated. On the ride home, I noticed that the back brake was sticking on a lot, so I couldn't use it, and also the engine really didn't pull very well. I was very disappointed with the performance initially. In fact, the high speed I reached was 55 miles an hour down a very steep hill. I figured something's definitely wrong, so we're probably going to need to strip the thing down. So we started work on the engine. Took the cylinder head off to find a concave piston. It's not supposed to be concave, I thought. So then I took the barrel off and found there was a piston ring missing. No wonder the thing hadn't been running very well. In fact, it says a lot about the toughness of these little bikes. The thing even got me home at all. Somewhat surprisingly, the cylinder and the bottom end was completely undamaged. It seems like the thing had just broken its piston ring and shat it out of the exhaust. So with that done, we cleaned and rebuilt the carb, put new fork seals in, converted it to 12 volts because the lights were terrible, and did a rather nifty paint job, well I think at least, on the tank, giving us a rather nice looking machine that we started with. It's still a little bit plain, so we put a Harley LED light on it. Then we changed the seat and put lower bars to give us a much nicer sitting position. And while we're doing all that for good measure, we took the wheels off and changed the brake pads. But even after that, I have to say they were still a bit crap. Then it was simply a matter of patching up the exhaust. We had to put a new down tube on because that was rotten through, and found an exhaust seal from a 250 twin. On the road, we found the bottom end was surprisingly punchy for such a tiny engine. A lot better than a lot of four-strokes that you'll get today. The top end though, the bike kept dying. It really didn't pull at all. So we stripped the exhaust back end out and found that some numpty had cut the baffle down. This just made the bike run terribly, so I managed to find a new baffle off eBay, shoved it in, and the bike ran so much better. It just ran right to peak revs and pulled all the way up. A bit quieter and better too. Tom was a little bit disappointed because he quite liked the groovy sound it made before that. There's a bit of a rumour going around that two-strokes are quite peaky. In principle this isn't really true because they can bust twice as often as a four-stroke does, so a four-stroke single of the same capacity should actually develop less torque. In practice, once you start to tune them up and you start putting cans and turn them into a sort of resonance engine, then they operate over quite a narrow rev range. But on a simple bike like this, just designed to potter around town, the engine performs surprisingly well. Of course there isn't a lot going on downstairs, I mean it's a 100cc bike after all. But if things build towards the mid-range and towards the top, it's pretty good. I mean, considering it's 100cc's, it will put a lot of modern 4-stroke 125s to shame. And as for the exhaust note, well, two-strokes are the ultimate Marmite bikes, aren't they? You either love them or hate them. Personally, I quite like the sound they make, particularly when you scream them along. They have quite a satisfying noise to them, and this one doesn't disappoint. It's a great little bike to ride. The new seat that we put on was a quite comfortable thing really, considering it was pretty cheap. The low bars meant that you were leaned forward, much more ready for action on the very high things that had been fitted to it originally. And the thing rocketed up to about 60-65 without too much trouble. Getting much beyond that takes plenty of patience, but all in all, considering the size of the engine, pretty impressive really. It's got a 5-speed gearbox of course, and I found there was an awful lot of slop in the connections. So I bought a new one and found that was almost as sloppy as the old one. But the gear change still worked pretty well. It's not like you had a lot of missed gears. It just felt a little bit weird and a bit cheap, which I suppose it probably was. The clutch, as you would expect, is light and copes fairly easily with the fairly limited power that's available. The chassis is probably the bike's weak point. Clearly cost cutting has been done here. The brakes are marginal at best, they were never cutting edge, not even in their day. And the suspension is a little bit bouncy and a little bit cheap, but it works well enough and the bike handles very well, because let's face it, the thing weighs next to nothing. It's a lot lighter than a modern 125, there's no fuel injection, nothing clever bolted to it, it's just a simple machine after all. So what does all that mean when you actually ride in it? Well, what it means is, despite the cheap suspension and the fact the thing gets a little bit bouncy, it handles pretty damn well actually, because it's so light and it's very nippy, very chuckable. And that little two-stroke engine, because it's reasonable torque, pulls the whole plot along really well. Makes for a lot of fun. Pulling the thing out of corners and opening the throttle up has a lot more response than you might expect. And there's a very eager little noise. There is some vibration of course near the top end of the rev range, but then, you know, it's a single cylinder engine, so what would you expect? But it's never bad. I mean, at the end of the day the internals are very small, so it's never going to be concussive. There's just a light buzzing, and in some ways that sort of adds to the character of the thing. I suppose the disadvantages compared to, say, a modern 4-stroke 125 are fairly obvious really. There's no electric start, and it's all a little bit crude by comparison. You're not going to get the same fuel economy because, well, it's a 2-stroke. But seen as a classic, then it makes a really good choice. They're much cheaper to buy than pretty much any other classic machine, or classic era machine, I should better say really. And probably give similar performance. After all, if you go out and buy a 250 BSA or Triumph, anything from the 1960s, this thing's probably going to keep up with it fairly easily. And of course the great thing is, you won't feel guilty if you give the little bike a fair hammering, because, well, it's just a cheap little bike, isn't it? So, but I'd imagine these things are going to start to appreciate in price, as these things always do. So if you're going to get one, I'd get one fairly soon, before the market starts to catch up. So in short, if you're looking for some sort of project bike, particularly something that's older and may have a little bit of almost classic cachet, maybe these are a really good choice, or at least bikes like them. It's going to be simpler to put together. A 2-stroke is about as simple as you can get, and parts are still relatively cheaply. The piston cost is just a few pounds, so it makes a very practical choice if you've got a project in mind. And it's a lot of fun too, and that's probably the most important thing about any machine. Well, I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe. And of course, thank you very much for watching.